Good morning.
Morning.
Great to see you all out. Please forgive my tardiness. My bunch decided Easter was the day they wanted to get sick, so we were dealing with that this morning. So I hope you all are doing well and had a good week so far. What a beautiful day. Go ahead and grab your Bibles out if you would. Be opening up to the book of Mark. And we made it about halfway through the first chapter. We kind of set up a little bit of our background, kind of our backstory of where exactly we're going. And so I wanted to go ahead and take this time to get through the end of chapter 1, because really we left off a couple of weeks ago when we were looking at this to really point our direction into chapter 2. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll through a couple of these. Now remember, and going back to this, the main question we're looking at as we go through Mark is the question of who is this man? And so whenever we went through this a couple of weeks ago before our gospel meeting, we had gotten up to verse number 15 of chapter 1. And remember, the biggest thing we were pointing at was how quickly Mark is moving through this progression, how fast he is going as far as explaining this and really just getting to the point. And he is directing our attention to the answer of this question of who is this man? Because remember, at the very beginning of verse number 1, we are introduced to Jesus Christ. We're introduced to the beginning of his gospel. Remember, the announcement is made there in verse 1 that he is the Son of God. And so now Mark is going to spend his time telling us why that is the case and how we can know that that is the case. And so going over, and I'm going to go ahead and go down to about our slides. And so going back to the verse number 16 where we left off, I want you all to look at that with me, because now we see the calling of the disciples. And I want you to look and think about this as far as what the other Gospels do that Mark does a little bit different whenever we are introduced to his first disciple. So let's go ahead and look at verse number 16. And if you're keeping track at this point, this is the 7th scene that happens in chapter 1 alone, and we're not even halfway through the first chapter at this point. This is how much information Mark is giving to us at this point. So let's read verses 16 down through verse number 20. It says, "Now as he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew his brother casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And Jesus said unto them, Come ye after me, and I will make you to become fishers of men. And straightway they forsook their nets and followed him. And when he had gone a little further thence, he saw James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, who also were in the ship mending their nets. And straightway he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the ship with the hired servants, and went after them." Now, stop there for just a second at the end of verse number 20. And as we examine this, in verse number 17, what sticks out to you the most of what Jesus said here to do? Follow him. Now, is that the summary of this point of the Gospels as we have seen here? As we've seen the introduction of Jesus. Remember, Mark is directing our attention to the answer of who is this man. And he is telling them in verse number 17 to follow him. Now I want you to look at this. In verse 16, what were Simon and Andrew actively doing in verse 16? Fishing. Now, were they fishing like we may fish for leisure and going out for crappie and bass? What are they fishing for? With their nets, yeah, that's their livelihood. And they're at work. They're doing their work. Now, I want to ask you a question here. Verse 16 is you see the description of them and you see what they're doing. How long do you think they are going to do that throughout a day? You think they're probably going to spend their day fishing, aren't they? I mean, that's their livelihood. That's how they make an income. That's how they make a living. And so at the end of verse number 16, you see that's what their profession is. They're fishermen. And so in verse 17, whenever he says to come, and the word there, come ye, whenever you see that, that's that word follow. He's saying to come behind me, to follow after me. Are they the ones choosing the direction they're walking, or is Jesus the one leading the way? Jesus is leading. He is the one setting the direction. He is going and saying, follow. Now, no rabbi, which is something we're going to look at here in a second as we get into the end of this, and especially in chapter 2, there's no rabbi that's going to say the phrase of follow me, or at least they shouldn't. That is reserved for one alone, and they have a problem with that later because they'll come on later and tell us that, well, the only person who can really say, follow me is who? Jesus. And who is Jesus? God. And so if God is the only one reserved for being followed, and that should give us a pretty good indication of who exactly this is. Now, I want you to look at their reaction to verse 18. If you need to know anything about the attitude of Simon and Andrew at this point, what did they do in verse 18? Immediately. You notice he makes sure in verse number 18 to add that word so there's no confusion of how long it took for them to follow him. That word straightway is as immediate as you and I can imagine. Immediately, what do? Immediately, and I think you have the picture there. Mark describes it for us so that you see exactly what's going on. It says they forsook his nets, or their nets, didn't they? So if you're actively in your day working, and he says to come and follow me, and you're at your job, that's either shutting the computer or closing down what you're doing and following him. That's what they're doing. They straightway turned away, they forsook their nets and followed him. Now, I want to ask you this. In verse 17, what does he say will happen if they will follow him? What are they going to become? Fishers of men. Now, let's ask this question. Anywhere in this, do you see where Jesus promised them wealth, health, or comfort in what he told them to do in verse 17?
No.
No. In fact, we don't see that. We see quite the opposite. It's not part-time volunteer work that he is calling men for. It is full-time discipleship. And so the boat that they left behind, they leave it behind, and as they go a little bit further down, we're introduced to verse number 19 and 20. So as you see the other disciples we had, they go a little further, verse 19. You see James, the son of Zebedee, John, his brother. What are they also doing?
Men in the nets.
Yep, they're men in the nets. The same thing occurs in verse number 20. And this time, what do? Well, they do the same thing, don't they? They leave behind, and in this case, they're leaving behind their father with the other hired servants that are there. And the end of verse 20 says, went after him. And that's such an important illustration for you and I. Whatever he asked, they followed. And we'll see some different examples of that. But from the very beginning, we now have 4 disciples that are introduced to us at this point through verse 20. And all of them have had the desire to immediately stop what they're doing and follow him. What does that say to you that they saw the importance of what Jesus was doing? And these men were fishermen. That was their livelihood. That's how they're earning a living for their families. That's how they're making ends meet. And immediately, they see the need to go and follow Jesus, and that's exactly what they do. So a lot of the attitude within the disciples can be seen here. So think of this, and I want you to think of this in your head, and you don't have to draw it in your Bibles, but between verse 20 and 21, I want you to just look at the reactions that have taken place by the people. So as you get down to verse number 21, let's read verse 21 on down. This is going to be the 8th scene at this moment that we see taking place in chapter 1. So let's look at verse 21 following. It says, and they went into Capernaum, and straightway on the Sabbath day he entered into the synagogue and taught. And they were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one that had authority, and not as the scribes. And there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. He cried out, saying, let us alone. What have we to do with thee, thou Jesus of Nazareth? Art thou come to destroy us? I know thee who thou art, the Holy One of God. And Jesus rebuked him, saying, hold thy peace, and come out of him. And when the unclean spirit torn him, and cried with a loud voice, he came out of him. And they were all amazed insomuch that they questioned among themselves, saying, what thing is this? What new doctrine is this? For with authority commandeth he even the unclean spirits, and they do obey him. And immediately his fame spread abroad throughout all the region round about Galilee. Now, stop at the end of verse number 28. So now we see, and this is, once again, we're moving quickly. We've picked up Simon and Andrew, we've picked up James and John, and now verse number 20, they go and follow after him, and then in 21, they leave from where they're at and they go to Capernaum. And it says there, they go in on the Sabbath day, and where does he go first?
Synagogue.
Goes to the synagogue, and what does he do in the synagogue?
Teach.
You teach. You go in there and talk. That's his job to do. Later on, what do we see the apostles doing? As Clint's going through the book of Acts on Sunday mornings, what do they do? The same thing. They go into the synagogues and teach. And so they're following after that example of Jesus. And as he's teaching, Look at our reaction in verse 22. What happens? What do they see? Now, the word there that we see, astonished, that's a really interesting word. It's sometimes translated astonished, amazed, but the real word is overwhelmed, is what the idea is. They're overwhelmed. Their brains cannot process what Jesus is teaching. They can't contain what he is teaching. And the reason that is the case is in verse number 22, he's doing something different. He's doing something that they're not familiar with. And what exactly is he doing?
Teaching with authority.
Teaching with authority. Now, let's ask this question and think of the difference. If the scribes are the ones that interpreted the law, then what is Jesus doing here that's different? He is the one making it. He is the one teaching as though he has authority. And he's talking about it's new. It's not just different, but it's better. And so we're looking at what exactly he's teaching, because as you see there in verse number 22, and you see their reaction to it, now look at verse number 23. So you already have him introduced as this person that's teaching differently. He's not teaching like the rest of them. You see, whenever I get up here and teach, I'm teaching the way that the scribes would, as far as I'm reading the word that's taught. Jesus is doing something different, and he is establishing law. He is the one that is going and one having authority to do that. And so that's the shock that they have. And it's an even further example of how shocking the encounter is that Jesus has with them. Look at what happens in verse 24 and following. It says this man has an unclean spirit. And I want you to look at verse 24. What exactly, or who exactly cries out, verse 24?
The unclean spirit.
The unclean spirit's the one that cries out. And the unclean spirit says something that to this point have we seen anybody else say other than the author, other than whenever we see John paving the way. What does the unclean spirit say? He says, leave us alone. And who do they recognize him as?
The Holy One of God.
The Holy One of God. And they know that something is happening. They know, and whenever they say this in verse 24, the unclean spirit at least, it says, art thou come to destroy us? Now, the Holy One of God, hopefully it sounds familiar to us. That's a title that's used in the Old Testament, especially as you go through Isaiah and you look at a lot of the Messianic prophecies. That's a title that is given and attributed to the Messiah. This is not a random term there that they're using. This is something that they will say. And I'll show you something else interesting if you want to kind of jot this next to verse 24. This is not the only time that the unclean spirits, the demons we call them, are going to recognize who Jesus is. They know who he is. It's going to happen again in verse 34 of this chapter. It's going to happen in Mark 3, verse 11. And then in Mark 5, verse number 7. The demons consistently know and recognize who he is. And I want you to look at what Jesus does. In verse 25, the question for you and I is, how does he get rid of this demon? How does he get rid of this unclean spirit? Does he use rituals? Does he use incantations? Does he use magic? What does he use?
He speaks the word.
He speaks the word. And so, where then is the power of God seen? In verse number 25. Jesus' word. And he says, hold thy peace and come out of him, and that's all it took. And so, whenever you see this in verse 26, there's some resistance he tries to make, but who is ultimately in control? Who has all authority? Jesus. Which, if Jesus has all authority, and in verse number 27, so now they're amazed again. And there's that same word used. They're stunned, they're overwhelmed at what they are seeing. And they're asking the questions. You know, here he is, and he's teaching with authority. Not only is he doing that, it says he commands even the unclean spirits, and what do?
Obey.
They obey him. That's interesting, isn't it? You ever thought about that? The demons even obey him. And so as a result, verse 28, this is not a small event anymore, is it? This is not something that's just in the corner of the world nobody knows about. Now, his fame is starting to spread abroad. And so here's a great question for anybody struggling with who Jesus is. The demons know who he is. Do we? Can we recognize who he is? They knew beyond a shadow of doubt who Jesus is. They know what his mission is there. They know his power. Now, here's another thought. that Jesus is coming, and what is he doing to, we might say, the kingdom of Satan at this point, the realm of Satan? Is he derailing that realm? Is he showing truly that his kingdom is the one that has authority? His word is the one that has authority. And so you have an undeniable sign that is fulfilling what we read all the way back in verse number 3 and 4 of John preparing the way. And remember, what did Jesus say in verse 15? The kingdom of God is at hand. And this is undeniable proof. The kingdom of God is at hand. Where's the authority? It's with Jesus, it's with God. Not with Satan, not in the realms of the demons. And so you see the people begin to react to that, and we'll see a bunch of different reactions at this point. Now, to this point, if we were to stop at the end of verse 28, you would say the only real reaction we've seen is the people are astonished, right? They're amazed, they're not sure what to think. Just notice the reaction of the people as we continue going further into the story here, especially in chapter 1 going into chapter 2. So any other thoughts through verse number 28? That's why whenever you get over to the book of James, that's why you can look at him pointing out that the demons, the devils believe and tremble, that they recognize that there is a God. Now, I have a question for you, though. And here's an important thought for all of us. In verse number 24, does the demon know who Jesus is? Does he believe that Jesus is the Holy One of God? Is the demon saved? Why not? If he believes, doesn't he? Is that enough? James's point is that the demons also believe, but having faith and faith alone is not enough. Satan himself believes. So either we have one of two things happening here. Either demons are saved, or it takes more than belief. Jesus says it takes more than belief. What does he say back in verse number 15 that they had to do?
Believe.
Believe. Follow him. Verse 15 says to repent and believe the gospel. And so keep that in our mind of what exactly it takes. Whenever you see Simon and Andrew follow, you see James and John follow, what do they do in verse number 15? They fulfill what Jesus says to do as far as following after him, which is what he says in verse 17. All right, let's look at verse number 29. Our ninth scene of chapter 1, if you're keeping track. 29 through 34 is a section dealing with healings, and also you have a messianic secret here. That's an interesting thought. So let's read down through here, verse 29. And let's just go down through verse 34. We're going to kind of put those two together. It says, and forthwith, when they were come out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. But Simon's wife's mother lay sick of a fever, and anon they tell him of her. And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her, and she ministered unto them. And at even when the sun did set, they brought unto him all that were diseased, and them that were possessed with devils, and all the city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many that were sick of divers diseases, and cast out many devils, and suffered not the devils to speak, because they knew him. Now stop at the end of verse number 34. So we're introduced to an interesting person in Simon's life. So we say in this way in verse number 30, Simon's wife's mother. Well, who would that be? And what would you and I say that is to Simon?
Mother-in-law.
Simon's mother-in-law. So evidently Simon has a wife. Well, to have a mother-in-law, you usually need a wife, don't you? So he's married. He's married. He's got a wife. And whenever they go into the home, in verse 30, we are told that she lay there sick. And anon they tell him of her. So they go and they tell Jesus what's wrong with her. They tell her what's going on. And what does Jesus do? It says in verse 31, and there's one word in particular there I want you to look at that separates Jesus from anybody claiming to be a faith healer today. It says, he came and took her by the hand, lifts her up, and how quick did it take the fever to disappear? Immediately. Now, wouldn't that be nice if you had a fever and it immediately disappeared? That'd be a relief, wouldn't it? Usually, especially as time goes by, you wake up and you're sick, and maybe you wake up one day and you feel a little better, and then finally, maybe a week from then, you finally feel back to yourself. But it says, immediately, the fever left her, and what did she do? She got up and she began helping and serving them. She didn't stay in bed for longer because she didn't feel like it. And so as a result of that, and everything that's happened to this point, reading verse 32 through 34, what else happens now? And by the way, verse number 32 says at the evening. You and I say at the evening time. The same day, how many people are gathered around? It's like the whole city came out, didn't they? Everybody that's heard of this, when the sun sets, they brought unto him all that were diseased, and them that were possessed with devils. Now, how many times did Jesus fail to heal someone or cast out a devil? He didn't. 0. He did not fail. He cast out all of them. It says, I love verse 33. Can you imagine the scene that's taking place here? I read something in a book a while back that said the largest room archaeologists have ever uncovered in the city of Capernaum was a 19 by 21 room. A 19 by 21 room, you can probably fit about 50 people in there tight. So this is not a small, or he's not in an auditorium. You know, he's not in a concert hall. They're in a very humble place here as you see this taking place. And it says in verse 33, how many people are at the door? It's like the whole city was gathered at the door. And when it says the whole city was gathered at the door, if I said the whole city and the whole town is out, there's not 1 or 2 people standing by. The whole city is there. And in verse number 34, he's going and healing them. Now, there's an interesting thought here at the end of this. And here's a question for us. He says for the devils to not do something. What are they not to do at the end of verse 34? Just speak. Now, we already know back in verse number 24 that the demons recognize who he is, that they call out who he is, but he's telling them here in verse 34 to not talk about who he is. Now, we have here what's called the Messianic secret. And as you go through, especially the book of John, and I want you to, if you're jotting this down, jot down John chapter 7, verse number 8. John kind of sheds some light on the wait here that's taking place. Why exactly is Jesus waiting to deliver this message of who he is? And remember, he'll even tell his disciples, won't he, that some of these things he's trying to keep under the radar. Well, why would that be the case? His time had not yet come. His time was not yet up. And so whenever you think about the journey of Christ, and you think about his journey as he begins his teaching, John talks about how he needed time to prove himself before the authorities came. When you think about what the Romans see, the Romans are going to see him as a political threat. Look at what he's raising up. And a lot of the Jews later on, towards the end, whenever we were approaching Jerusalem, what do they think is happening? They think he's assembled an army. They think he's going to overthrow the government. They think that's what he's there for. Whenever you get to the end of the teachings of Christ, you find crowds so large, he can't even move, can he? And so he says there's things that he has got to do before it is truly revealed. So, any other thoughts through verse 34 about this journey? A lot taking place here today, isn't it? All right, so let's go on down. Verse number 35. Scene 10, if you're keeping track. Verses 35 and 39. And just think of how this is taking place. So we were told in verse 32, this is the evening time. This is whenever everybody is coming to him. But in verse number 35, and in the morning, rising up a great while before the day, he went out and departed into a solitary place and there prayed. And Simon and they that were with him followed after him. And when they had found him, they said unto him, All men seek for thee. And he said unto them, Let us go into the next towns, that I may preach there also, for therefore came I forth. And he preached in their synagogues throughout all Galilee, and cast out devils. Now stop there at the end of verse number 39. Two main things we're going to look at. In verse number 35, and you see there in the picture, so they go off to bed, everybody's asleep. How early in the morning did he get up? It says, the King James puts it this way, he rises up a great while before the day starts. This is before everybody else gets up. And you think, what does he go out to do? He goes out to pray. And it says he goes out by himself. And where does it say he went? Solitary place. And he goes out to pray. Whenever you think about the need here that Jesus is doing, in the middle of everything going on, he still protects his need to pray. He still protects his need to go there in his time with the Father. And so Simon comes searching there in verse 38. They come looking for him. And you think back, what exactly does he leave him for? Well, he leaves him to be separate, to be in a solitary place. But you think about verse number 36, aren't Simon and the rest of them doing what he asked them to do? They are, but he also needs his privacy. But you see in verse number 36 and 37, they come up to him, and it's kind of a problem. Because in verse 37, it's a good problem, but it's still a problem that's taking place. So they get up, they're looking for him, he's in a solitary place. At the end of verse 37, what does Peter say? Man, where are you at? He says, look, everybody's looking for you. Everybody is waiting for you. And so in verse number 38, instead of going back, what does he say that Jesus did?
There's some place to teach.
That's right. So he goes out to these next two towns, or goes out to the next towns. And I want you to look there at the end of verse number 38. At this point, we know he has healed every sickness brought to him. He has cast out every demon. He has done all of this. But he says there, his ultimate job is to do what? To teach. The end of verse number 38, he says, that is my purpose. That is why I came. That is what I am here to do. And so the healings, the casting out of all these demons, they're proving who he is. But he still has a job to preach that message, because that message is what's going to carry on. And that message is the importance there of what he's doing. Everything he's doing up to this point is proving who he is. But he still has to preach and teach the message. So any other thoughts through verse number 39?
Of all the people that he cast the demons out of, what exactly would have happened to them at that point? Because did they have repentance when the devil was, or the Satan was thrown out and became faithful then, believers? Or were they just healed from the illness and that's it?
That's a great question. You know, what gets me is in verse 26. So, and Andy brings up a great question here. Now, to say I know the answer beyond a shadow of doubt is probably not true. This is just because we're not told so much about it, but we are given a few glimpses. So, and Andy brings up a great question. Look at verse 26. What happens to the individual who has these unclean spirits is the question we're looking at. Well, in this particular one, notice what the unclean spirit had done at this point. Evidently, it was not necessarily an easy experience for the one. It says he had torn him, and whenever he had cried out with a loud voice, it came out of him. Now, there's times that we see this, and we'll see it as we go through later, where it does get better or worse. But as far as what happens to them after the fact, that's a great question. Sometimes we're just simply not told. As far as is what happens to them, what they choose to do afterwards. And Danny brings up another point there, that there's some of them, especially if you see verse 26, that with these demons, there's ailments that are taking place with them. There's physical problems that we see. And so it definitely seems like in a few of these cases that goes along with it. But as far as the spiritual side of it, it would seem that Jesus demonstrating his power over it, it's a great question. And I wish we knew more about it. But you would think as a result of that, because of that proof, that they would follow after him as well. What do you think, Clint? Anything to...
I was just thinking about, how many people do you think he healed of sickness and disease? Like we were reading about, the whole city's out here. Did they all follow him? I think a lot of people just came to be healed.
That's exactly what it is.
And once they were healed, they were like,
yeah,
great.
Yeah. Well, and you see the interesting thing is, and even later on, whenever we see him, the multitude following after him, a lot of them are there for what? Well, healings, and then the other half, what are they there for? To eat, food. And you have a giant multitude. Well, whenever you see some of these things take place, though, and maybe it doesn't necessarily go to what they're thinking, they leave, they disperse. And so Clint's right. There's a lot of these occasions where these people come, maybe their ailments are healed. But I would say the same thing, because it definitely appears that he heals more people that are willing to follow him, especially at this point. Which may be a question, and maybe the answer to the spot is maybe those same ones very well could have followed back after the world. Very easily could have. But I think that's absolutely a true observation, that you think of how many people there in verse 33 and 34. I mean, the whole city, like listen, the whole city's out there. Everybody's waiting for him. He's healing all of them. And I don't know how many that translates over to. It's a great thought. And by the way, I'll give you one thing here before we close. We're running out of time. Verse 34, when the King James says they were sick of divers diseases, that's just diverse. It's just a diversity of diseases. It's just a multitude of different things that they had. It wasn't that all of them were coming to him and, they all had the same thing. He's saying a multitude of different, diverse things that he has, and he's able to heal. Now, we've got a very small piece of time left, and I want to read you this passage and then we'll quit, because this will be something for us to think about, because it's directly going to relate to chapter 2. Read the end of chapter 1 with me and we'll close. Verse 40 onward. It says, "And there came a leper to him, beseeching him and kneeling down to him, and saying unto him, If thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. And Jesus, moved with compassion, put forth his hand and touched him, and saith unto him, I will, be thou clean. And as soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy departed from him, and he was cleansed. And he straightly charged him, and forthwith sent him away, and saith unto him, See thou say nothing to any man, but go thy way, show thyself to the priest, and offer for thy cleansing those things which Moses commanded for a testimony unto them. But he went out and began to publish it much, and to blaze abroad the matter, insomuch that Jesus could no more openly enter into the city, but was without in desert places, and they came to him from every quarter." Now, stop at the end of verse 45. So we end the chapter, and we're introduced to an individual case. Now, to this point, we've got a lot of healings. We did see Peter's mother-in-law. And so whatever you see here, this taking place, now we're introduced to the leper. And the leper is an interesting one, because if you are dealing with a leper, what's the one thing you probably don't want to do? You don't want to touch him. That's right. Well, why would you not want to touch him for our practical sense? I mean, what's going to happen? You're going to catch it. You're going to get infected. And so much of the leprosy and the way they deal with leprosy, this is a ancient quarantine is basically what they would be in. And they're kept away from people as a result of them not wanting to pass it along and not wanting anybody else to catch it. So think about what he does to the leper, and then think about the reaction of the people in chapter 2. Now, as you get to the end of chapter 2, or the end of this, and we'll pick up, we'll kind of go through this in detail next week, but I do want you to do this. Read through Mark chapter 2 this week, and as you read through, mark or circle or jot down every time someone questions Jesus' authority. Mark down every time someone questions Jesus' authority. And then we're going to look at the question next week really heavily. What do people do when God's rule challenges their traditions? Get into that next week. It'll be a good chapter to go through. But to get a chance to do that, appreciate your time and comments. We'll take a short break here before we get started with worship.